Hello. Well, thank you for taking the time and offering the time to talk with me, Dil. It's super exciting to be able to talk to a person who's actually worked with Christopher Alexander. He's been a great inspiration to me and to many other people. So I've always wanted to learn more. I heard a little bit about your story of how you worked with him. But I've always wanted to learn more. And now that he's passed away last month, at actually, I would say a fairly good age of 85,
Yeah, yeah,
may we all last that long.
sure.
It seems like an appropriate occasion to remember him and
Perfect.
to your story of how you worked with him.
Hmm.
So
I'm
yeah,
grateful to be asked.
let's start at the beginning. Uh, how did you first learn about Christopher's work and what were you doing then?
So it was a sort of pincer movement. So I'd started studying architecture and I sort of spent my first year as a undergraduate architecture student trying to figure out how to do architecture as punk rock, because that was my main thing at the time. I was in a band. It's very influenced by all the philosophy and sort of deeper stuff going on behind punk. So I did a project which was sort of cut and paste. I took lots of photographs of other buildings and I cut them together and made a facade that was a sort of the equivalent of the cover of Nevermind the Bollocks, all the cutout lettering and all this sort of stuff. And I was just sort of figuring out, really, beginning of second year, that, oh, hey, buildings are not songs. You can't turn the radio off. You can't replace one with another at the drop of a hat. They cost a lot of money and they're there for a long time. And if you make jokes, the jokes get old, but the building's still there, all those things. So I was beginning to learn the difference between different media and the responsibility of a designer, a maker in different media. So I was sort of ready for some constructive stuff. And then two things happened. One, my mother, through a friend of hers, sort of said, oh, you might like this book, and gave me or told me to get The Timeless Way of Building, which is the companion volume to A Pattern Language, and a very important book. But coming at that book from a punk starting ground, it just didn't work. It was all sort of happy, nice, lovely, make everything beautiful. And the world that I was in, the world of the early 80s, was, impending nuclear disaster, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, mass unemployment, anger in the streets, and, everything beautiful sort of was not really quite gritty enough for me. But then within about 6 weeks of that, my coolest lecturer, who is architectural theory, started talking about pattern language. And pattern language, he was introducing very much as a sort of structuralist. He was sort of influenced by, so there's some famous Dutch architects, Herman Hertzberger and various people like that, whose architecture was very much about building frameworks which were relatively mute, but very open to inhabitation, so that people could turn them into places. They were being very humble about architecture. They'd learned that modern architecture wasn't very good at making places. It made spaces, and it made them cheaply and efficiently and robustly and all those things and practically, but they didn't seem to turn into places. So they'd begun to realize that human beings bringing their lives to a building could add a layer of meaning and inhabitation to that. And there's an excuse for a modernist to do that, because Le Corbusier had built an estate shortly after the Second World War, which he wasn't very fond of, I don't think. I think it's called Preshak. And then he went back there 20 years later, and people had put pitched roofs on and funny little hokey countryside porches outside the modernist front doors. And he famously said, this is an example of the architect being wrong and the people being right. So even as a modernist, there was this, a diehard modernist had said this. So there was a sort of way in. And so my lecturer looked at pattern language as a structuralist thing. It was sort of almost a sort of Meccano kit that you could, right, we'll have 3 of these and 1 of those. But these are quite interesting Meccano kits because they're not, this piece is 6 inches long with a hole at either end and made of metal. It was, this is what a connecting strut looks like. It tends to have a joint at either end, and it has some stiffness to it, and it has a length to it. And this is how you make a good connecting strut. So he was sort of saying this is a very interesting sort of structuralism because it's less prescriptive. So that was the sort of beginning of it. And I had written a letter to the Architects Journal as a student the year before saying, I'm a bit underwhelmed by my architecture theory research because it basically seems like most of these architects are post-rationalizing what they wanted to do anyway. And then they're pretending that it's got all this rigorous thinking behind it. And I don't think that's true. But it wouldn't be a bad idea if there were some rigorous thinking. Where is it? You know, can you help? You know, and I'd got this letter back from the editor saying, oh, well, I think the tenets of modern architecture are a perfectly useful rubric for blah, blah, blah. So I had a sort of hole in my thinking about architecture, and pattern language fitted into it beautifully. So then I just read it and I studied and I read it. And then I think I had to go off for a year and work in a architect's practice and sort of learn things. None of that was very interesting. And all the while I was in this band, and that was very interesting. And I took another year out in the band, and that was very interesting. And then it was time to finish my degree. And so I came back, put the band away, stopped doing that, and came back. And I decided pretty quickly I was going to try and use pattern language for all my projects. And that was sort of acceptable to the staff. They were a bit bemused by it. They hadn't expected me to take this lecture point seriously. But I found it incredibly useful as a framework on which to build. You know, I didn't find it like a Lego kit at all. I tried to use the ideas. And about towards the end of my year, I thought, well, I don't know that I'm doing this right. Don't know what I'm doing. I can't think of anywhere in the UK that's going to tell me. I better go and study with the guy. And this is all before the internet and everything. And I probably didn't do it very soon. I couldn't figure out how to apply for a place at Berkeley, which is where he was teaching in Berkeley in California. And I got all these myriads of documents back talking in Americanese about all the things I needed. And I didn't have any of those things, and I didn't know how to get them. And so I thought, in the end, I just thought, sod it, I'm going to go there. So I finished my degree. By that time, there was a little mini boom. So I went to London and got a contracting job. And it's the only job in my life where every single month I've asked for a pay rise, and every single month I got it. So I got a pay rise every month for 8 months. And then in October or something, I just wrote to Chris Alexander and said, I'm coming. And I turned up in California and just went and knocked on the door, and he said hi and invited me around for dinner. And eventually I figured out what to do, and I ended up paying the university and just enrolling in the class, which it turned out had almost no requirements. It was America. If you paid, you were in. So I studied with Chris for 4 days a week, and then worked for him for free for 3 days a week, building a little house up in the hills in the wine country north of San Francisco, which was I think the first building he ever got contracted to build. And it was this sort of ludicrously tiny budget, and everything was being done by volunteers. And it was a fantastic learning experience, absolutely fantastic. And so I was learning theory 4 days a week, and then mostly just doing grunt work 3 days a week, but occasionally doing a bit of actual practical stuff. And then I got to
So
do all
you're
sorts.
saying,
Yeah.
sorry, so you're saying this was the first building he got contracted? So he published the books before he had built much?
He pretty much didn't build anything. And so he published his first book, which was his PhD thesis, pretty much the end of the 50s, 61 or something, which is called Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which was a way of using a computer to help you break a design problem up into a tree of smaller problems. So he actually built a tree diagram of, so he did something in architecture we call an adjacency matrix. Lots of people have got versions of this. So all the issues are written across both sides of a matrix. Where they intersect, you give them a score as to how strongly related they are. So you only really need one half of the matrix. So then he doesn't go into detail in the PhD, but I'm pretty sure what he did is wrote a little algorithm that worked out how to ignore the lowest number of scoring into relationships so that you could build a tree which had no linkages which would stop it being a tree. You know, leaves weren't allowed to talk to leaves and they were only allowed to talk to a bigger branch. So you get this nice, neat tree diagram. So he got, I think, the Pritzker Gold Medal for Research, which is the highest theoretical architecture medal, highest value theoretical architecture medal in the world. It's an American award for publishing that. So his PhD thesis got him a huge architecture prize. He's 22 or 23 or something like that. And so he went to America. He was the youngest ever. He was on tenure track before he was 25 at Berkeley. And then he contracted for the BART. I mean, you know,
public transportation
the underground.
Bay Area.
Yeah.
Bay Area Rapid Transit, I think.
That's it, which was all under construction at the time, obviously. And so he tried to use his technique for them. And he fell out with a lot of his clients, and he obviously fell out with them. And in 1965, so only 5 years after he finished his PhD, which made him sort of famous, he is one of the 3 or so founders of a discipline that's now, you know, all over the place called design methodology. It hadn't had a discipline name before that. And he'd already, before he was 30, repudiated his thesis. He wrote this article called "The City is Not a Tree." And in it, he said, if you can discern any connection between any aspect of the city, because he never really talked in systems speak, even though that's what he was doing. If you think of the relationship between any aspect of the city and any other aspect as meaningful, then it's probably meaningful. If you ignore that, then some part of the life of the city is going to be constrained or deleted or broken. The point that he raises that he fell out with the BART people on is he made a linkage between there being a little newspaper kiosk on the platforms and public safety. So for the BART, for any operator of a train network, public safety is just a huge stick to beat them with. They can't possibly ever let anyone die if it's not a human being's fault. It can't be the design's fault. But they didn't want messy newspaper kiosks on stations. And maybe they were worried about fire hazard and things like that, because there are competing things. So that's what he talks about as a broken linkage. So here's a public safety thing which matters. It's messy and annoying for the engineers, so they don't like it. So they've broken that linkage and they've diminished the liveliness of the BART network, which is one of the most antiseptic and dull underground networks I've ever had the misfortune to be in. You know, it's the opposite of the Moscow
It's interesting
underground.
that you mentioned that, because I think I spent quite a few years in Japan, and now as I think back, the older train lines, they have those little kiosks, and they
Right.
sell, like, some newspaper, drinks, some, snacks and whatever. And I never consciously thought about, but the new ones usually don't, like the
No.
modern deep tug. But I never consciously thought about it. But now that I think about it, you're right. It adds this air of just like a little point of humanness, of like something alive.
Mm, mm. And somebody speaks to somebody who isn't the person they're traveling with. You know, you go and talk to someone, and if you're in trouble, you can go and say, are these trains all cancelled? You know, it's not all those things. But of course, the King's Cross disaster in the UK in the, I think, when was that, mid-80s, turned out that there were decades worth of, little bits of paper and things like that, which once a fire started, caused a firestorm. So yeah, maybe public safety is still better without kiosks, I don't know, but certainly the liveliness, as you say. So he writes this essay, which is only 10, 15 pages long, called The City Is Not a Tree, which, by the way, I contend rather cheekily contains all the useful information in 2 volumes written by Deleuze and Guattari about rhizomes and all that sort of stuff, without any of the obscuring nonsense, and predates their work by at least a decade. So in 15 pages. So anyway, that's a little dig, I admit to it. So then once he'd realized that he couldn't do this matrix and then trim the awkward bits of it that stopped him making a tree, he realized he had to have something that was much looser fit. And I don't know the process whereby pattern language arrived out of that. I guess he looked at these design problems and realized that, oh, well, actually, there's quite a lot of recurring ones. The way you enter a building, the psychology of it, the topology of it, the sets of relationships involved are recurrent. And, they might vary from building to building, but could we describe the things which are special to the business of getting into a building, the main entrance of a building? What is that about? And obviously managed to. But it takes a lot of work, having tried to write patterns myself. Whereas you can write a list of handy tips and tricks, if you're an experienced professional, in maybe a day, you can write quite a lot of condensed wisdom that you've learned. If you want to turn those into patterns, that's weeks and weeks and weeks of work. So almost nobody writes proper pattern languages. So
let's go back. Tell us a bit more about the human side. So you got to California, you're studying 4 days a week, and you're working on this house for 3 days a week. What was it like working with him? What was he like as a person?
So you hardly got any FaceTime with Chris. Like many sort of high reputation people, he had a guard squad around him, and they were his PhD students, his teaching assistants. And so the course that we did, he would give the keynote seminar. I think we had 1 seminar with him a week. Sometimes he wouldn't turn up because he'd have to go off and do something else. We had 1 seminar with him a week, which was pretty sort of serious, and you didn't really get much one-on-one at all. And then you would be tasked with the week's homework, and you would come back and you would deliver that. And then usually he would sort of pick 1 or 2 that he thought had the qualities that he was interested in and talk about those a lot. So you really had to want to you had to have your ears open, you had to want to listen, you had to want to try for yourself to implement and search for the things that he was finding and looking for and encouraging you to look for. There was there were no tips and tricks. It was very much, well, I say about the things I say in the words that I say. And if you've watched public lectures from Chris Alexander, you get the feeling that I mean. He's quite particular about his words, but they're not really terribly practical about what you're actually going to do. So you really had to want to be there and want to work at it, which was great because that's the only reason I was there. So that was fine for me. And it was a very small, where there was like 13 or 14 of us. Because by that time, which was 89, I think I got there, he was already pretty much at war with Berkeley. He'd been trendy as you like after he published Pattern Language. Everyone was amazed by it. But the backlash came very, very fast because it does carry with it a lot of quite poorly concealed moral implications. It's pretty moralistic. If you're not doing this, if you're not caring about the things, then probably you're suffering from fear or greed, or there is an awful lot of that buried in the nice words and the practical seeming stuff. And
interesting.
Artists, architects like to think of themselves as sort of cousins of artists, which is really a bit rich, but that's what they like to think of themselves as. So anybody that comes along and says, oh, I've published a book and this has got everything that matters for architecture in it, just follow these principles that I've laid down and you too will be able to make something as gorgeous as an Italian hill town. They've began to, I think, fairly reasonably in a way, or unsurprisingly, be a bit peeved. And this was also the beginning of postmodernism. So there was a brand new load of architects coming along with Umberto Eco, and they had some new theory behind them. Deconstruction was brewing. There's a famous recording of a debate between Chris Alexander and Peter Eisenman, which are the two sides of that debate, where Chris Alexander sort of loses the plot and gets very angry, and he doesn't, but he sort of loses the argument by comparing Peter Eisenman to Hitler, which he doesn't, because Peter Eisenman's a descendant of Jews who escaped the Holocaust, and so's Chris Alexander. His family were Austrian and got out, I think, in 1937.
Would you say then that that was just the nature of his ideas, and maybe actually he was a bit ahead of his time? Or is it that he was not skilled enough at communicating his ideas in a way that they would be accepted more widely?
I don't think he cared. He knew what he was about. He knew that it mattered. He knew that he was onto something. It was very hard work he found it, and I think it's very hard work. He found it very hard work to pull what he knew was there in the universe out into stuff that he could communicate and actually implement to make buildings. He didn't really have much time for worrying about what people would think of him. I mean, his written communication is beautifully lucid. It's not dressed up in fancy Dan intellectual speak at all. It's all as simply, clearly written as possible. So, he'd laid it all out for them. But yes, there is a pretty heavy moralizing undertone to a lot of it, which, is very, very difficult to cope with. So architecture as a discipline had this, its whole history, architecture has been not very powerful people getting to be powerful, getting to spend enormous amounts of money because they consent to be the handmaidens of money and wealth. You know, architects serve money and wealth. They always have. And then,
well, I mean, they used to serve God for a while. But...
okay, they served God, yeah. But I mean, you know, only gods that had access to lots of money, because you can't afford to build a building. Yeah. And then there's this really weird window from 1945 to 1975, very broadly. It's only 30 years, when Western Europe and some of America as well, and the Soviet Union said, well, the Soviet Union had been trying it before, said, no, architecture is in service of people. And all the people that trained me had been trained during that period. And modern architecture had used the rhetoric about architecture is in the service of the people a bit up until the Second World War, but it did them no good. Modern architects were dirt before the Second World War. You go to the center of Chicago, it was almost all built in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, all those Art Deco scales. Same with downtown Manhattan. The City of London was basically rebuilt in the 1920s and 1930s. Before the crash, there must have been the biggest boom in commercial city center buildings ever seen in the world, in the rich capitals of the West. So none of those architects were modernists, not one of them. They were all rolling in it. Lutyens got so busy that he started to take commissions where he said, I'll just draw you the elevations. You can figure the rest out. I don't care. That's how powerful they were. And so these people who are now considered the gods of modern architecture, Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright had a bit of work, but never really got rich. All those people, they were just starving artists in garrets. They were nothing and nobody, except that they made a lot of noise and they had a few rich patrons. Almost all the buildings they built were fake modern buildings. In other words, they were all built with artisanal craft and then rendered with white render and painted white to make it look as if they'd come out of a machine. But they all depended on very skilled handwork. There was no machinery involved at all. It was all a huge put-up job. The only reason modern architects won in 1945 is because they said, basically, oh, we'll build cheap stuff with none of that ornament. So you'll get Europe rebuilt on the cheap. And also we'll break the artisan guilds because we won't give them any work. We'll just use grunt laborers with almost no skill. So it was a Faustian pact with capitalism and also, you know, state communism that allowed modern architects to win.
And also driven by the need to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. Which was undeniably true. Yeah.
I spent a long time in Japan, and one of the reasons that I left in the end is that I couldn't take the monotonous ugliness of much of the construction, most of the construction. But yeah, that was driven by the mentality of we have to rebuild from the war and we're poor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
and if you're poor, you don't have time. But let's go back to Christopher Alexander, since we wanted to
sorry.
about that. So Christopher was, in a way, we got into where he was against the establishment and against, or he was seen as being against the establishment. So, but you said that this movement was, you know, architecture was for the people. So which part of demoralizing was it, or how was it that it caused the clash with the establishment, do you think?
Well, in 1975, there was a sort of world property crash following the oil crash, and suddenly the idea of building buildings for the people was just not on, and there was, you know, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, all that sort of stuff. So those sort of, the idea of architecture as publicly funded for people was under attack from that day forward. And so these architects by the end of the 1980s were wanting rich people to build wow factor buildings and have fun and be exuberant and not worry about moralizing, because hey, their clients were immoral and they knew they were immoral, and they didn't want some sort of snooty professor saying you shouldn't be doing this. You know, they wanted to, you know, postmodern was all shiny shoes, you know, sort of, you know, padded shoulders, you know, glitzy bits. There's a famous, there
So
was a
that's
film called,
the disco and cocaine generation,
yeah,
that decade,
yeah.
right?
There's a film called Architectonica who built really flashy, cheapo postmodern jobs, but they were very whizzy to look at. And they built this hotel in Florida, which had a big square missing out of the slab. And the square, you could see it on the ground next to the building. And it was the sports club and the swimming pool and things like this. And it had quite a lot of brightly colored sort of balcony things stuck to it. And there was a hurricane. And I heard the hotel manager interviewed on the news. And he said, yeah, we had quite a lot of damage. A lot of the architecture fell off, but the building's fine. That's what postmodernists did. They stuck architecture onto ugly, cheap slabs. And they wanted to be able to get on with that because that's where you made a career. So they didn't like this moralizing. And who can blame them? You know, there was no money in being Chris Alexander, none at all. So he only started building then really like the mid-80s was the first time he actually, you know, built things. So he learned the hard way about building on the job.
This was already like what, he was 20 years into his career or something, right?
Actually, that's not fair. No, that's not fair, because in fact he spent a year out, I think, after his first degree in India building. He had always believed in building, and it's probably maybe late 70s maybe he started really building. He did absolutely believe in the need to be a builder and an architect at the same time, because that's what gives you the chance to not just build a drawing. And that's why I think he's the father of the agile movement, because he's the one that said, don't do a drawing and then just recreate it in 3 dimensions at full scale. Do the least amount of drawing you need to be able to get started, and then look again. You know, is that window really in the right place to get a good view of that tree? You thought it was.
That's something that's completely impossible with modern planning regulations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
So he was at war with the whole system.
That was, I mean, I guess that was the vernacular way of building, right? If you build a house in the countryside, you started and then, you know, you rested a bit and thought some more about it, but completely impossible now. So this house.
I did it several times, several different ways. But anyway, this house
that you were building with him, did it get finished?
It did in the end, yes. It's an insanely impractical house, but I think the people liked it. It's built onto a slope like this with big boulders and big trees all over the place, and it was carefully slotted in around and among the trees. And it was an amazing thing. Very, very, very peculiar. But yeah, had some lovely features.
How long did you stay?
I only stayed a year. It's actually only technically 10 months. I stayed a whole, I arrived in November and left in the sort of July or something. He asked me to stay, but he didn't have any money to pay me. They were doing a competition for an exhibition center in Tokyo, which was an enormous competition. Lots of people all over the world entered it, and all the famous people. And he wanted someone who could draw, because he didn't believe in drawings. So he didn't really attract students who could draw beautifully, because what would be the point? The thing that they had labored to get good at, he was not even going to give any credit for. But I had learned to draw painfully, and yeah, so he thought, oh, well, you'll be useful. But I sort of said, I can't stay if you can't pay me. And he sort of said, well, that's a shame. So I thought, right, okay, I'm going home. And I did. It was a disaster for me. So I came back, I had a place at university to do my second degree, my postgraduate degree, and it was being taken over by this deconstructionist, aggressive careerist deconstructionist, and he and I just fought, but he won because he was a lecturer and I was a student. So after about 8 weeks, I left and did my second degree part-time while making furniture. I went and started making things with my hands. At a place where I could get away with anything because I was only a part-time student. Although they did take my diploma work down because another deconstructionist took that university over while I was there. And she was so horrified by my drawings. And the part-time students didn't get a room, so we were in the corridor. So everybody would see my drawings, even if they didn't go into the rooms. And I turned up and it had been taken down. And one of the lecturers who was friendly to me said, yes, I had to argue very hard so that you can put it up in the back of this room, but she won't have it in the corridor. That's how much there was a culture war going on in architecture at the time.
So then you went on to start a practice, yes?
Well, no, I made furniture for a good 3-4 years. So I tried to do mini, and I did a tiny little architect. I tried to be Chris Alexander. I tried because he makes small items to practice choosing and getting things right. And so I designed a few things that I could make. Couldn't make a living out of it. Designed some pretty things. Made a nice chair. One day I'll get back, but the person who owns it still wants it. And then I ran out of money and was convinced to go and get a job with a proper architecture firm. So I went and got a job with a proper architecture firm for 5 years and learned how to use CAD and all the things that I needed to know. And but then 2000, I started my own practice. Yeah.
2000 you started it.
Yeah. On the basis of a job, two domestic jobs, but one of which was to do a barn conversion for my sister, where she said, I want you to do a Chris Alexander. So then we got to do all the, we drew it all for planning permission, but then we didn't build it like the drawings if we didn't want to, and just dared them to do anything about it, which they didn't. And so we did all the, so by the time I'd arrived, this is important actually, by the time I arrived in California, which is 10 years after publication of Pattern Language, Chris Alexander had long since realized that pattern language wasn't enough, that actually it was a good set of practical tools, but that if you didn't know how to use those tools, you were just going to get a different version of rubbish. So there are about 4 monthly magazines in the United States for people who build their own houses. It's a common aspiration for middle class people in America. It's quite rare in Europe, and I would say, I don't know whether it's still true, but certainly it used to be that there was never an edition of those magazines where one of the featured houses didn't say, oh, and we used pattern language. But then you would look at these houses and you would think, okay, so pattern language is not good enough, because they were not very good. So he was, by the time I was there, I think he'd written the first draft of what became the 4-volume Nature of Order series, which had all the really useful stuff. So it had the mirror of the self test, which is, okay, you've done your pattern language thing and you've still, it's just told you how to make a decent doorway, but there's still a million choices to make. How do you make those choices between this option and that option? Do you really care if it follows the pattern, or do you care if it's genuinely the best door you can make? How do you tell the difference? What's going on when you do that? So that was a really big one.
But going back to Christopher Alexander, you say that he, in the end, he didn't build so much.
No.
So how did he have this? I mean, I have the 4-volume series. It's sitting there for me to be read one day. How did he get this kind of practical and depth of knowledge if he wasn't, everyday building things?
Well, he did go, so probably, and as I said, I probably got it wrong. He probably started building about 1980. He built quite a lot of, so they built their own offices. So they built a house-sized building in Martinez near Walnut Creek, and I'm sure they sold the site for, I don't know, quite a lot more in the late 90s. The building's gone, of course. It's probably now, part of some Google campus or something. It was, right. It was just sort of a little suburb with fields with horses in them and things like that. And now, of course, it's all Silicon Valley overflow. So they built a house. He did a project. There's a book called The Production of Houses. They did a lot of building for a self-build community in Mexico, sort of publicly funded self-build things. He went and did an awful lot of building. They built the San Jose homeless shelter that was nearly finished when I got there. And he probably did 5 or 6 houses. And when you build the Chris Alexander way, probably each of those houses is as much experience as you would get doing 10 houses if you were doing it the ordinary way, because you're up to your arms in making mock-ups, making models of things, doing weird construction techniques, because he always loved a weird construction technique that would allow him to do more interesting things. So he'd probably paid a lot of attention over a decade to doing a lot of building, and that taught him a lot, I think.
So when you started your practice and when you tried to apply the Christopher Alexander way, how did it go? What was good? What were the struggles?
The struggles were, number one, you put your finger on it. The planning process expects you to do it, to know what it's going to look like before it's done, and you're very vulnerable if you change certain things. Certainly the outward appearance afterwards. Also, the contractual process is very difficult. So the standard legal basis of a contract is, I'm going to give you this, you're going to give me that amount of money, and we both agree. If someone varies that, any part of that, the amount of money or the quality of this that I give you, then the contract is broken. So building contracts have long realized that can't work. They're too complex, and probably software contracts are the same. There's all this special contract terms about change orders. When the client changes their mind, or when the builder says, oh, this hole's got to be twice as deep as you said it was going to be because there's sand here and not rock like you told me there was going to be. So I've got to charge you more money, and you can't say I've broken the contract. So building contracts have quite a lot of flexibility built in, but they still punish you for changing your mind. And there's all sorts of good reasons sort of why. So Chris Alexander wrote a different sort of contract, which said, okay, what this contract does is it says the architect and the client and the contractor have agreed on a sum of money that's going to be spent. And they've agreed that the architect is now empowered to get the building built and make a lot of decisions after the contract's been signed. And as long as you don't burst out of that sum of money, everyone's going to agree. And that's a very nice idea. But of course, contractors are machines for finding loopholes in contracts. I mean, big building construction is more about finance than it is about building anymore. All of the people who actually do work on anything above a few million are subcontractors. The main builder does nothing. They might have a small in-house works department to deal with emergencies, which would be embarrassing, or go back and do snagging, but they don't employ. So they're just all about money. So if they're all about money and building contracts are complex, then they're all about employing lawyers who find ways to screw more money out of the client through the contract. Forget the reason why. So I tried, though, in my little way, to write these sort of contracts with my clients in various different ways. And I suffered a lot from doing various different clever things to allow me. So like I designed a whole window system where you just machined all the timbers, but you didn't cut them to length, so that I knew the detail that the windows would have, because I could mock that up. I knew that I liked this sort of a windowsill and that molding would look nice. And then I got the joiner to machine all the timber and have it ready. And then we mocked the windows up on site, starting off with what the planning drawings said, and then 3 inches bigger, 3 inches smaller, move the mullions this way, move the mullions the other way, masking tape stuck over a hole in a building site. It was being built in the winter, so I had my assistant, who'd never done anything like this before, thought I was insane. We were doing it by street lights at 5 o'clock in the evening in the dark, shining a torch on it. And I'm saying, move it a bit to the left, move it a bit to the right. But honestly, if you just take that seriously, your whole consciousness goes over a little threshold and suddenly you can see the window, or you can feel the window. And then you know, yeah, it was better half an inch to the right. I know it's only a bit of masking tape in the dark, but it was better. Better is better. That's as much time as we've got. Measure where the masking tape was. That's what we build. And that's what you get really good at. So it's not that you get the best, you just get the best that you've got time to make in the real context in which you're building, which actually is a beautiful way of collapsing all the complexities of time, cost, money, quality, what you care about, because your consciousness says, I'm satisfied, we're done, take that measurement. We probably could make it better, but not enough to be worth bothering with. Or to be honest, we're fucking going home now and building it according to the planning drawings, because it's only the toilet window anyway, and it's round the corner. You know, you got really good at that sort of thing. And what was really good about that is it's a brilliant regret minimization strategy. So when later you look at it and you think, that's not as good as it could be, you can remember the afternoon when you made that decision. You say, well, fucking hell, I'm amazed I did it as well as that was. And you just move on. It's really, really, so life lessons, big life lessons.
So it sounds like the thought of Christopher Alexander still affects you, or how you see the world and how you do work now. You've moved from architecture to changing the monetary system, to changing how we trade. So how does your time with Christopher Alexander affect your worldview today?
So around about 2005, I probably had, well, actually I had read James Gleick's Chaos book actually before I went to study with Chris Alexander. I think I probably was reading it on the train, and I tried to engage him in conversations about chaos and complexity, but he was having none of it. So I'd been thinking about complexity science, and you know, I'm an architect. You know, did maths up to 18, but I'm not looking at it in that way. But it deeply interested me. And about 2005, it began to become concrete for me that pattern language was just one domain in which you could use the practice that had led to the book to document a complex set of systems. And I began to think, okay, I've always been, you know, environmentally motivated in, you know, very beginning of my architectural career before I heard of Chris Alexander. I was trying to do low energy buildings. I've always been worried about environmental things. And I began to realize again in the 2000s that all this climate stuff and the economy that creates the climate problems are massive complex systems, that they're not susceptible to simple solutions. And I began to think that pattern language might offer a framework for improving our capacity to interact with those complex systems in an assured way, in the same way that the original pattern language allowed me as an architect to interact with the complexity of human psychology and sociology and the city and construction technology and the law and the budget, and make a pretty building, a beautiful building, hopefully, but I don't claim that for myself. Maybe this technique. So I got so excited about that I wrote to Ward Cunningham. It took me quite a while to find someone who would connect me to Ward Cunningham, but I did, and said, look, what we need is a tool like Wiki, because by then I knew that he'd written Wiki to document the work he and his colleagues were doing on building software patterns. Wiki comes from Chris Alexander, by the way, if you didn't know that. but it does. Not direct lineage, but Ward built it because of his work trying to do what Chris Alexander had done in architecture for software. So his gift to the world is a lot bigger than the best-selling architecture theory book of all time. So I wrote to Ward Cunningham and I said, what I need is a tool like Wiki, but for writing patterns in, and it needs to be much more structured. And Ward said, oh, well, yeah, And I've talked to Ward since, because David Boville knows him, and I've been on some of the calls about Federated Wiki, which is his current project. And he doesn't really like that idea of building straitjackets around stuff. That's for other people to do. He likes to do the simple bottom of the stack cool trick, which is the basis of Wiki. It was for other people to do, wikis that they made money out of that you could actually use for a company documentation stuff. He just, yeah, that's cool, but I'm not doing that. But he had written something for the company called Eclipse, who make, I think, IDEs and things like that, who were really big at the time. I don't know whether they've been bought by someone, but he'd been working for them as some sort of consultant emeritus sort of thing, which is what Ward tends to do these days. And he wanted to understand all their projects and show them how all their projects fit together. So he built something called Wiki Tech, which was a sort of structured wiki that would build the sort of network diagrams that pattern language allows you to draw. So I'm just going to show you what one of those looks like, because I can do it, because I've got one in here. There it is. Yeah. So that diagram is a Chris Alexander diagram of what he calls a semi-lattice structure. I think it's got a more canonical mathematical name these days, but that's probably what he found in the 70s. So you can see it's got this sort of directed structure that a tree has, but it hasn't got the rules that a tree has. It's anything's allowed to connect to anything, but there is still a hierarchy.
So it's kind of ecosystem thinking, network thinking.
Yeah,
that's great. So for people interested in Christopher Alexander, where would you recommend they start to enter his thought space? Well,
I do think that A City Is Not a Tree is a really good one, because it's very short. It's, as I say, it does an awful lot of the stuff that the people who've had to go and talk about rhizomes and mycelium and everything like that. It does all that stuff in plain language in about 15 pages with diagrams. So it's very, very useful. And then if they are of a more touchy-feely turn of mind, then The Timeless Way of Building is a great way in, because that really does speak to the heart. If they're more nerdy and like to think of practical implications, I think pattern language is still a fantastic way in. Those still are probably the nature of order is just too sort of philosophical to be useful unless you've done the other stuff. I mean, it's a beautiful set of books. I mean, if you're of a philosophical turn of mind, then maybe The Nature of Order is interesting. Although it's quite hand wavy for real philosophers. But it's very beautiful, but it's very expensive. Those three are probably the obvious ones. The other good ones are The Oregon Experiment, which is the third of the original trio, is fantastic on bigger practical approaches, some really just very, very good ideas there. If you're going to do a giant project, put 10% of the budget aside right at the beginning for fixing all the things that got ignored while you were completing the giant project. That just on its own is gold dust. Nobody does it. It's really hard to get people to do it, but actually everybody knows the thing of, right, we delivered, we got it more or less on time, we completed the feature set more or less on time, and now all the money's spent and we're all exhausted. And yeah, don't come to me with that bullshit about, you know, why are these two rooms connected together in this way? Because you signed it off, you spent all your money, we probably did 10 times more work for you than we thought we were going to do, so live with it. So he's got, yeah, but also the University of Oregon documents a master plan for a university in the middle 70s, which they are still using a version of. Now, I've done a bit of university master planning in the late 90s. I worked on as a junior, I worked on a master plan for a big expansion of the University of Cambridge, the UK, big prestigious project. And it was absolutely obvious that this master plan wasn't going to last 5 years, because Norman Foster was going to build a building on the site. And what Foster's did, as soon as they saw the master plan, they did a building which was at odds with the master plan. Just to say, well, you know, we don't care about your master, we're Foster's, you know, we've got a direct relationship with the chaplain of the Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And if we say his sports hall ought to be built like this, he's going to build it like this. You're going to have to change your master plan. And if you go and look at old master plans, they're 10 years old and they're in a drawer, nobody's seen them. And you get them out and people laugh at them. The University of Oregon is still using a bastardized version of the scheme that he devised for them 50 years ago. That's an astonishing achievement. I mean, they've ruined it, but they're still notionally using it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me chunder on and on and on. But yeah.